Okay, hello and welcome to Reading Redhawks. My name is Stephanie Jameson and I am the Assistant Director for Mission, Spirituality, and Vocation in the Office of Alumni Engagement here at Seattle University. Before we begin, I want to offer this quote from James Baldwin that Isabel Wilkerson begins her book with. The book is Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, which is what we are talking about today. The quote is, "Because even if I should speak, no one would believe me. And they would not believe me precisely because they would know that what I said was true." As we begin our gathering, we respectfully acknowledge that while we are physically located all over the world, we are all on occupied Indigenous land, and Seattle University is located on occupied Coast Salish land and is on the homelands of the Duwamish people. We pay respect to Coast Salish elders past and present and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this region, whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to the land and the water, and whose lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants today. This Reading Redhawks session on caste in the United States features two of my esteemed colleagues from Seattle University, Ariel Rosemond and Dr. Alvin Sturdivant. Ariel Rosemond currently serves the Center for Leadership Formation, assisting in strategic management of program operations, project stewardship, and general communications efforts. Ariel has completed a Leadership EMBA at the Albers School of Business and Economics. Dr. Alvin Sturdivant is the Vice President for Student Development at Seattle University. He is also an adjunct professor for sociology. His scholarly and professional interests include examining the effects of oppression and discriminatory practices in college communities, exploring the experience of students of color in higher education, examining campus climate in the context of bias-related acts and behaviors, and exploring the experiences of African American men in higher education. It is integral to note that Ariel and Alvin are generously providing their time, talent, and emotional labor with us today. Their words, perspectives, and opinions are theirs alone and represent their unique, singular experiences. Their voices are not wholly representative of any one group. I offer ground rules for our conversation today. What we hear here stays here. What we learn here leaves here. This is to say that any stories that are shared are to be stayed in this room, but the learnings that you learn, the tangible ways in which to use this material should leave here and be used in your everyday life. Normalize calling in when we've made a mistake. Acknowledging that we are not experts, we are learning and growing together, and we acknowledge that we are coming from diverse perspectives, platforms, and places of privilege. We engage in dialogue. We do not debate in this space. It is okay to ask questions. It is okay to acknowledge we do not have the answers. Be mindful of sharing space and airtime in today's conversation. It is important to be aware of how much space we are taking up and if that consumption is inhibiting others from engaging in the conversation. A few Zoom housekeeping items before we begin our program. For optimal Zoom viewing, I recommend that you be in speaker view during both Ariel and Alvin's presentations today, and then switch to gallery view for the interactive conversations. You can switch your view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. I recommend changing your name in Zoom to at least your first name, and if you're an alum, consider including your SU class year. You can also include your pronouns here as well. You can see my name as an example of how you can do this. You can utilize the chat box to ask questions, provide comments, share resources, etc. Please remain muted for the duration of the program unless you are called on for the question and answer portion at the very end of the event. You can virtually raise your hand by clicking on participants at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a blue hand icon. If you're having trouble with any of these features, please reach out to me directly for help. Today's program will flow as follows. We'll start with Ariel, who will take us below the surface of Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. And then Alvin will walk us through historical context. The three of us will then move into a fishbowl dialogue around a few discussion questions derived from the text. At the 1 o'clock hour or just before, we'll do a soft close for those who have to leave, and then we'll transition to audience Q&A. At 1:20, Ariel will conclude our program with a summary and a call to action. Throughout the entire program, though, attendees are encouraged to offer comments or questions in the chat. We will also share these in a follow-up message as well, any resources that are shared. And without further ado, I will hand it over to my friend and colleague, Ariel.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you all of you for showing up to this and listening as I actually work my way through this book. I hope you enjoyed some of the pre-linked material. I'm going to have some scripted remarks that, just to get us through the beginning of this, and then I'll shift to a more conversational tone, the tone you probably know of me, shortly thereafter. So I thought I'd start my comments by highlighting a passage from the book Caste that resonated with me. It's of Isabel Wilkerson's personal experiences. She uses this to close out the 4th chapter of the book on the emergence of caste in America. I quote, "A few years ago, a Nigerian-born playwright came to a talk that I gave at the British Library in London. She was intrigued by the lecture, the idea that 6 million African Americans had had to seek political asylum within the borders of their own country during the Great Migration, a history that she had not known of. She talked with me afterwards and said something that I've never forgotten that startled me in its simplicity. Quote, 'There are no Black people in Africa,' she said. Most Americans weaned on the myth of drawable lines between human beings have to sit with that statement. It sounds nonsensical to our ears. Of course there are Black people in Africa. There's a whole continent of Black people in Africa. How could anyone not see that? Africans are not Black,' she said. 'They are Igbo and Yoruba, Iwe, Akan, Ndebele. They are not Black. They are just themselves. They are humans on the land. That is how they see themselves, and that is who they are. What we take as gospel in American culture is alien to them,' she said. 'They don't become Black until they go to America or come to the UK,' she said. 'It is then that they become Black. It was in the making of the New World that Europeans became white, Africans Black, and everyone else yellow, red, or brown. It was in the making of the New World that humans were set apart on the basis of what they looked like, identified solely in contrast to one another, and ranked to form a caste system based on a new concept called race. It was in the process of ranking that we were all cast into assigned roles to meet the needs of the larger production. None of us are ourselves.' Thank you for that. So Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, it builds on a basic concept. So while the construct of race may be one of the most accessible tools we Americans continuously use to segment ourselves, prejudge, deny access to resources, oppress, and control, to really understand the gravitational pull of the unseen forces at the heart of our collective discontents, you have to look at the powerful framework that lies beneath, one that precedes race, the American caste system. She uses the metaphor of the United States as a house that's fallen into disrepair. Wilkerson guides us on a journey, an inspection tour, and she uses her light, uses her vision and observations to show us past the visibly warped walls and into the buckling beams and crumbling foundations underneath. Since publishing her Pulitzer Prize-winning Warmth of Other Suns, I haven't read it yet, she's been gathering the academic work of many and adding her own observations and stories to the mix. And she shares what she's learned about the origins and inner workings of the enduring Indian caste system and how it compares to what most of us won't even acknowledge in America, our own. She goes on to describe how early pre-revolutionary settlers innovated in dehumanizing their African captives, naming them Black and starting the process of codifying their oppression, building on a generational hierarchy of human value, with Blacks working to enrich the dominant caste and struggling against for resources with all the castes that would come up afterwards, in between. Ever since, through American Revolution, the Civil War, Jim Crow, civil rights movement into today, the American caste system has morphed to adapt and take in more folks and slot them in the right spots. Immigrants and every American child must learn to adapt to life in their caste within the hierarchy, struggling to find ways to climb or gain favor from higher castes, and fighting tooth and nail not to lose out to the caste below. Wilkerson does remind us that many academics and leaders have studied, published, reacted, been inspired by, and reacted to the American caste system, our reality beneath the surface. So, for example, she describes how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was initially put off when on a visit to India, he was introduced by members of the Dalit, or the lowest rung of the Indian caste system, as a fellow untouchable. And he wrote about the power of this concept and how he came to see himself as an American untouchable, part of the lowest rung of our American caste system. We end up learning how inspiring the work of Dalit thinker and leader B.R. Ambedkar was to him. A quote that she puts in there is, "Today, no leader in India would dare make a public endorsement of untouchability." This is what King told reporters. Quote, "But in America, every day, some leader endorses racial segregation." So, after bumping into this book, I've been thinking about the history and the concept of caste over the course of the spring and basically clear on until today, our presentation. While all of us have, in our way, navigated the horrors of so many who've lost their lives so senselessly, the marches that have gone global, and a movement, Black Lives Matter, for justice, and even through this most recent election and what it means for the United States and the world. And I can't help thinking about Philando Castile, a licensed gun owner, tells a police officer who pulled him over that he has a weapon in the car. His life would violently end shortly thereafter. And the officer, Geronimo Yanez, was charged with manslaughter and endangering the lives of Castile's passenger and his daughter, but was later acquitted of all charges. Most of us, including some gun owners, were outraged. Meanwhile, the dominant caste-led NRA met the event with a deafening silence. Wilkerson's work has been a helpful lens for me as I'm thinking about this, looking at racial and social injustice. As I experienced the news of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, he was murdered for jogging in a neighborhood near his home. Another member of the subordinate caste, all for encountering a member of the dominant caste, a former law enforcement officer, who deputized his own son to enforce the rules of caste and property. It's more than race. So I've had a number of conversations with members of this community, reeling Redhawks, about the nature of the fear that would push a woman to call police to save her from a threatening bird watcher in the center of Central Park, two professionals in New York City. I feel that Caste gives us some clues as to what led to that. Finally, I just want to say I feel blessed. I'm connected to this learning community. In addition to the conversations I've had with folks reading Redhawks, I've spoken to a number of faculty, staff, and alumni about what this all means for us, that nearly half of Americans will vote and gather against their own interests, seemingly, willing to follow a demagogue to whatever end as long as it lessens the threat to their precarious caste dominance. One of you, Dr. Alvin Sturdivant, Vice President for Student Development at Seattle U, agreed to share some of his more learned perspectives on the questions I was asking him. With that, I invite Alvin. Want to take on? I'll follow.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ariel, first for the invitation to be a part of this today. I would like to begin by affirming the introductory comments of my colleague, Stephanie. I'm no expert or high authority on the experiences of all Black folks or BIPOC folks, but I am a living witness of the catastrophic damage caused by the exclusion of Black folks. I have, over the course of my life, lived firsthand and studied the roots and systemic ways that caste, racism, classism, and white supremacy have continued to subjugate, terrorize, and decimate those of us who've lived our lives on the margins. I offer my comments this afternoon with that framing and backdrop, and through the lens of my scholarship and study of race and racism, discrimination, and oppression, but primarily through the lens of my lived experience as a Black Afro-Caribbean man having grown up in the Southern United States. As you all likely know and understand, the idea of caste is not a new one, but as defined by Wilkerson, is a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste whose forebears designed it. So caste is about power and the allocation of resources, assumptions of innocence, competence, and worthiness. Caste often operates beneath the conscious of our person and is about dominance. It existed in colonial times before the US was formed as a world superpower and serves as one explanation for the divide, polarization, and tensions that continue to exist today. The pervasive racism, classism, discrimination, and oppression that so many in the US experience, and was the difference between life and death, true life and death, for Trayvon Martin, the Michael Browns, the Breonna Taylors, the Ahmaud Arbery's, the Sandra Bland's, and the George Floyd's that lived among us. What incidences of the last several years, and frankly generations, reveal is that there is no safe place, no safe way to behave, no protection against the real threat of caste, of racism, and white supremacy, the effect that it has on the lives of so many. No longer are we watching Black and white footage of racial clashes during Jim Crow and segregation. No longer are we watching films based during slavery and seeing the subservient and dehumanizing experiences of Black and brown folks. We're watching in real time the terrorizing of Black and brown people by the very nation that promotes the protection of civil liberties and personal freedoms, a nation that was built with caste as its foundation. The wave of protest and social unrest sweeping across the nation, our state, and our city is an effort to make legible the visceral experience of the devaluation and invisibility of Black humanity, of which the over-policing of Black bodies is one symptom, and rooted in the coupling of caste and racism. In real time, we are watching the weaponization of caste and race by police and community members, as Ariel talked about earlier, against Black and brown people. This is horrifying for many, if not all of us. The history of caste and racism is as ancient as the arrival of the first Africans to this country. The history of the US as an economic superpower was built through the subordination, marginalization, and exploitation of African people. The establishment of Africans as an inferior ethnic group upon their arrival to the US has subjected generations of Black Americans thereafter to an inheritance of hate, discrimination, abuse, bigotry, and intolerance, and white Americans a legacy of wealth and supremacy. For many, both here and abroad, the US serves as a symbol of hope, as a representation of the possibilities that await as one moves towards the American dream, towards meritocracy. For so many others, it represents pain, despair, a history of violence, victimization, and brutality, much of which Wilkerson discussed in Caste. It signifies the loss of life, liberty, and basic human rights. It also denotes a lack of academic preparation, a lack of access to fundamental needs, financial insecurity, and racism. The history of Americans of African descent in the US has been debilitating and is but one very simple example of caste and what it means to be impacted by a system. The earliest roots of Americans of African descent in the US is rooted in what Joel Spring refers to as deculturalization. Deculturalization is the educational process of destroying a people's culture and replacing it with new culture. In this instant, it involves stripping African people of their culture, their language, and their religion. The first Africans in the US were forbidden from speaking in their native tongue and practicing their native religions. Deculturalization is about devaluing the very soul of a people with the expressed intent on creating a nation where whites reign supreme. Deculturalization also involved acts of racial segregation and the rationalization of cultural genocide. The first Africans in the US were denied the basics of learning to read and write. Even at the advent of the Common School and rapid and progressive developments in education, Blacks were systematically excluded from participation and subjugated to a life at the margins in positions of involuntary servitude, thus creating and maintaining a system of social reproduction and social inequity. Beyond educational and social inequities, there were numerous other policies and practices that served to further malign Americans of African descent. Dual labor markets, redlining, school segregation, exclusion from the GI Bill, and other practices that would serve to conquer their minds and bodies and leave them in poor health and unstable environments filled with poverty, crime, and disease. All of which has led to the disparities that are continue to exist today. Chicago Tribune contributor Christopher Borelli notes that caste is a ranking and order, a top to bottom accounting. The concept of caste, not unlike class, though different in important ways, is thousands of years old. Its roots can be extricable, its effects very real. Yet caste is artificial and arbitrary. There's nothing natural or inevitable about it. Caste, as the name implies, is like casting, with society itself as director. Caste insists that you were born into a role, therefore assigning you certain qualities, personalities, urges, deficiencies. You are a part of a caste, and so am I. So are your parents, and so are their parents. So the word itself, caste, sounds antiquated like feudalism or commonwealth, but as an idea, caste is alive and invisible. Wilson's work, as Ariel noted, sheds light on white supremacy as the bones, the system that holds the order of things in place and prevents the leveling of the playing field. And so I offer these comments as both a representation of my own sort of experience with caste and how it sort of plays out in my life, but also through the lens of history and how it's played out in the US. With that, I'd like to join in discussion with Ariel and Stephanie to further illuminate our understanding and review of caste as a concept and as a pillar of American life.
Thank you, Alvin, for your remarks. Thank you, Ariel, for opening our program. As I mentioned at the top, we are going to move into our Fishbowl Dialogue. So Ariel, Alvin, and I will start with a question. I've also put into the chat, you are welcome to also add questions that derive from our conversation or other things that you would like us to discuss, and we will try and pull from those for the next 30 minutes or so. So Alvin and Ariel, drawing off of really one of your last couple of remarks, Alvin, talking about caste systems and how they are thousands of years old and predate the idea of race. Caste systems are artificial, arbitrary. It's a ranking system, a construction of hierarchy. So in your opinions, how does reframing the conversation to caste move diversity, equity, and inclusion work forward? And are there ways in which this reframe is limiting?
Hey, thank you, Stephanie, for posing that question. I think I'll jump in first. The first thing, my reaction to that question is this. I feel like the concept of caste adds a third dimension to it. And so, you know, I'm looking at race, and as an American adult, a Black professional, I have the shortcut that I take once I open that paper or swipe through my doom scrolling or whatever, and I see, you know, this is a victim, this is the assailant, or this is, you know, this is the person that's been harmed, and I think race. But since reading this book and since bumping up into this, it feels like it's not just this two-dimensional thing, Black and white or indigenous or BIPOC. That construct is still important, and it's accessible. But that third dimension, being able to look deeper, helps me really start to understand, and I start picking out details that I haven't before. Yeah, I guess that would be my answer, at least for how it helps for diversity, equity, and inclusion. To understand that there's more at it than just the emotion. I don't have to prove that you are a racist, or, you know, a person is a racist, and now search through their history to find how their race, you know, what their actions have done has hurt someone or anything like that. Now, I can also superimpose, well, what's the context of caste on top of what has happened? How has it manifested before? And I almost don't have to defend against the idea that this person is racist because of that. Now, it can be limiting, because for one thing, it feels like Americans, and according to the book, apparently we are built around the idea of race, or at least we can accept it. It's more accessible than anything else. And so how do you call it anti-racism work? And is there some kind of conflict there with the folks that are actually in the fight versus academics who are thinking along these lines, or people like me who are playing them on TV? What do you think, Alvin?
It's interesting. I think about that question through the lens of the 8 pillars that Wilkerson outlined in the book, all of which, in my mind, connect quite well to the notion of white supremacy. If you read through each of the pillars, there's an element of each that is associated with white supremacy and is associated with the foundation that really holds the system together. I think caste is a softening of the language to some degree. It makes it a lot more receivable for a greater audience. I think really the undergird is white supremacy, though, that it really is about this system that has been in place for generations and generations and generations. In the language that Wilkerson has outlined in the text really makes it digestible and easier to understand and easier to receive. I remember when white supremacy was first used in our vernacular as a way to express oppression and discrimination in a historical context, in the negative sort of critiques that were provided in direct relation to that. And a lot of it had everything to do with just the very use of the words white supremacy and the historical connotations that are associated with that. Caste is very much like white supremacy. And if you look at the two sort of side by side, the elements of each are quite similar. But caste, I think, is far more understandable, and provides a different way to understand it, which I think can help further the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion in ways that the use of the language of white supremacy, right as it might have been and is, wasn't able to. There's still folks who, when they hear white supremacy, immediately become paralyzed and unable to authentically and vulnerably participate in conversations. But when you present it through the framing of caste, it's more invitational to some degree, and folks are able to understand it in ways that they just weren't through the lens of white supremacy.
I agree. I think using the language of caste allows white folks or folks who maybe are feeling defensive around the conversation of diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. It can move us to a space of better understanding and being able to see something as something that's built and designed, and then be able to move forward into action. Because I think, especially right now, I think we're stuck in this loop of conversation versus action. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about how this group can move into action following this session. Just wondering, for both of you, how would you frame this conversation of caste to a brand new audience, to somebody who hasn't read this book, who hasn't listened to the NPR article or articles with Isabel? How could we talk about this with our friends, our family, our colleagues in a way that's digestible?
That's a really interesting one. That's a really tough one to say. I will say that part of scheduling this when we have was about setting us up to answer that question for ourselves over the holidays, the oncoming holidays. You know, that this was after the election. This was, we could see what the world looks like a little clearer, but just before we leave to go back, well, or Zoom back home with whatever family members and their opinions, and, you know, literally half of America is on one side and half of America is on the other, and the entire planet is watching. And so I'll tell you how difficult this conversation is for me. I really see it when I look at my kids. The concept of I am part of the game. I'm part of the structure. I am actually, by my existence, how I interact, my success as a member of this community, all of that could be tied to caste and my ability to navigate through it. And so now I'm looking at a couple of children and trying to figure out, okay, it was tough enough to explain that, hey, you're a target if you get out of this house. One day you're not going to be that cute little kid. One day you're going to be a young man and a threat. I mean, as early as 12, according to our recent American history. And so explaining caste is so much more difficult, but the stakes couldn't be higher. So that's my non-answer to answer that I could give.
What I would offer additionally is, and this is broader than caste to some degree, and really has more to do with diversity, inclusion, and equity work, that oftentimes in order to effectively engage with an audience, you have to tackle it from both the cognitive and the affective domains. There's a piece of this that is associated with storytelling and making things a bit more personal and giving folks the opportunity to connect through their soul and their heart. That, of course, doesn't work for everyone. There are some folks where the cognitive domain is the most effective. And so you have to attack the intellectual and put data, numbers, evidence in front of them. And for some others, it's the combination of the two that works most effectively. So when I think about introducing caste as a new concept to audiences, I'm thinking about it through those three lenses, and having some understanding of what their past experiences are with these kinds of topics, and how they've responded to the introduction of this material in previous workshops, trainings, meetings, et cetera. Sometimes, folks can benefit from doing one-on-one work or work in isolation where they are reading and then later have the opportunity to gather in a space with others to unpack. And in some other instances, they do better when you are in a group setting. For me, it really is about understanding who I'm working with or who we're working with, and devising a plan that really gives us the best opportunity of helping those folks understand exactly what we mean when we say caste and what exactly we're talking about. My basic sort of impression with caste is that it's a systems-based issue. And so when talking about it through the lens of the system, and being able to offer some of the allegories or metaphors that Wilkerson used when describing it in the book, I think can be helpful for a lot of folks. One in particular, and I referenced this in my opening comments, is that, she talked about caste as the bones and race as our skin, which is a fairly simplistic concept, but it clearly indicates that caste is the foundation, and our skin really is what folks see. And so it manifests a lot of times through racism, but really what's underneath is this notion of caste as the system that serves to perpetuate racism and classism and a whole host of other isms that are at the root of what Wilkerson talks about in the text.
So if metaphors and allegories are useful tools to help explain new topics. Throughout her book, Wilkerson uses these tools to help us visualize the concept of the American caste system. The bones inside a body, we've mentioned that. The beams inside a house, I talked about that. And even the computer program in the 1999 film, The Matrix. Which of these metaphors helped the concept click for you? And why was it successful?
First, I think, I think allegories and stories are so useful, particularly, I think about my own family who sometimes gets very defensive or is not really ready for the conversation. And I see allegories as a way to take folks out of the text, right? This is why we read fables as children and story tales, things like that, that have some kind of meaning or messaging. We're always looking for the meaning or the message. And then I also think, particularly with white folks or white passing folks, we kind of play on white saviorism a little bit. So it's like, well, if I can be the hero in this story, or if I can move this forward, then I'm going to do this because I'm going to be like the good white person. And I think getting us even just through that, crossing that threshold is so impactful and so important, because then we can continue to have dialogue and continue to educate around this and move past that. We can recognize and be aware, but sometimes it's a little bit too much to hit with like all the hard truths all at once. People shut down and they really hold on to those caste systems and feel like, I earned this, I deserve this. And so I think to answer your question about which of those really, I think what comes to mind really, and I think both of you touched on this, is the bones and the skin and the structure, because you feel it in your body, and there's something like psychological that happens when you can feel it in your body. You can feel grounded in that, and then you can recognize, okay, I can see where this is coming from. I can feel it, and we can move through the world knowing that. So that's how I would answer that.
Well said, Stephanie. Alvin?
My perspective is quite similar to Stephanie's in a lot of ways. That the house metaphor is one that resonates with me as well, in thinking about house as a structure with the foundation, in the foundation in this instance being caste. And so our house has been built with the foundation as caste, and everything that we generate is associated with that. So as an example, a way to build generational wealth has often been tagged to the home ownership. And home ownership is something that is critical for the purposes of generational wealth, because that's something that you can pass down from one family member to the next, to the next, to the next. And throughout history, in many ways, that's how wealth has been accumulated and built. But when you look at it through the lens of oppression and discrimination and caste, what we know historically is that home ownership was only reserved for so many. And even through the civil rights era, when we were making progress, there were still systems like redlining in place that prevented, Black people and other people of color from owning homes in those neighborhoods where property value was more significant. And so I think about caste in exactly the same way, in that when the foundation that you built your house on is not one that is stable, is one that legitimately is lacking in relation to those who are in the ruling and or owning class, then of course the byproduct of that would be that you would not have available to you the same kinds of resources and the same access as other members in your community. And so when I think about my own understanding of caste and how I would teach that to others, I legitimately come back to this notion of the house and this notion of bones and skin, because those are ways that I can process through it in really coherent ways.
Thank you, Alvin. Again, thank you, Stephanie. You know what, as I look at the list, I mean, I wanted to agree completely with you guys, being a homeowner and knowing the disaster that it can be behind those walls and how much it will cost, and tearing down the house never seems to be an option. And in Wilkerson's text, she's not there talking about, as much as the foundation might be crumbling, about tearing the entire home down, just being aware of the damage that we have inherited and our responsibility to acknowledge it. And so, but as I'm looking at the list, I have to admit, rather sheepishly, that, my geekiness is flying a little bit. I think I like what she says about the Matrix, and I think it kind of fits. So laugh, all 37 of you if you want. But, looking at that list, I'm thinking how differently I saw the world after taking the red pill. After, every time I open that newspaper or scroll through that news site and started picking out ways that so much more than race fits into this. And there are parts in the book where she talks about, glitches in the system, where people in the dominant caste are no longer benefiting the way they could have hoped or could have expected because of the way the caste system is built up. She uses examples like the healthcare system, like I mentioned that before, or how much disease and life expectancy dropping for, a population where the folks at the top who are naturally called, not naturally, but who are forced through caste to be at the top, forego roles that would be better for who they are. And so it's just amazing for me to be able to see that. And I don't know, maybe the Matrix thing is more accessible to me. I'll keep studying and get more academic, but for now, I gotta say, of the three, that's where I'm at.
And Ariel, I know that you wanted to summarize and close us out before our final goodbye. So I want to give that space for you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, Alvin, all the folks who commented and put stuff in, and all the support in the chat, and just being part of this community. I have so much gratitude for you and for what it is that we've discussed today and your grace. I wanted to close out comments really quickly. Let's see. I have one quote I think might help us close out pretty well from the Wilkerson text. And it goes, quote, "We are not personally responsible for what people who look like us did centuries ago, but we are responsible for what good or ill we do to people alive with us today. We are, each of us, responsible for every decision we make that hurts or harms another human being. We are responsible for recognizing that what happened in previous generations at the hands of or to people who look like us set the stage for the world we now live in, and that what has gone before us grants us advantages or burdens through no effort or fault of our own, gains or deficits that others who do not look like us often do not share." That's Isabel Wilkerson. I really hope you're going to read that yourself when you purchase the book. There's a link in the chat. Finally, so again, I'd like to commend the work of, or I guess for the first time, commend the work of Dr. Natasha Martin and Seattle University's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and as well as Stephanie Jameson of SU's Alumni Association and her team for all of this, for getting this conversation on the calendar and getting me to have the guts to actually give voice to it. I have to thank all the colleagues, and especially members of our faculty here at Seattle University, in helping me understand what I've been taking in through all the media and getting ready for what it is that I'm sharing today. Quite a number of folks, but including really briefly, Drs. Holly Ferraro, Dr. Madhu Rao, Teresa Rothhausen, Terry Foster, Mark Cohen, and of course, my friend, one of my mentors, Dr. Alvin Sturdivant, Vice President for Student Development. I'm grateful to each of you for your attention and also for what you're going to do with what you've learned today. Stephanie, back to you.
So we love to close these out, not just with thanks, but also a call to action, because I think this can be so much to digest and to take in. So I want to offer a call to action and then invite both Alvin and Ariel to also share something. So I strongly believe that we can be activists with how we spend our money. And so I invite you to look into shopblack.com. I sent a link for Estelita's library where you can purchase books. Consider supporting minoritized businesses throughout the holidays and just in your everyday shopping, because I think, and share those resources with your friends, with your family, so that they too can put their money where their intentions are. Sometimes it feels like we cannot do a lot or that there's so much going on. But I would invite all of us to try and be more mindful of what we are consuming, who is producing it, how can we be more ethical and mindful in the ways that we consume goods and services in this capitalistic society.
I support all of what Stephanie just offered. I would also add taking advantage of the opportunity to engage locally. There are a range of opportunities available to all of us right here in Seattle or wherever you're coming from in the world, but really taking advantage of exercising the freedoms that have been afforded to all of us in using our voices for the good of everyone. The last that I would offer is if you are looking for ways to stay connected to SU in supporting our current students, there are many opportunities available to you and our colleagues in alumni engagement and with the Alumni Association are aware of many of those, but I would highly encourage you to stay as engaged as alums with our current students as possible, knowing that many of them look up to you and see you as role models and as mentors and could really benefit from your expertise and advice. And then lastly, would encourage you to think about your spheres of influence in those folks who are connected to you, who perhaps need to be engaged in this conversation, but aren't, and you could be the linchpin to get them connected in real ways. You're sharing your perspectives, sharing your story, and your understanding of these kinds of issues might be exactly the push that those folks who are not engaged in this need at this particular moment.
Thanks, Alvin. Thanks, Stephanie. There's not much more I can add or ask for, but I will do one more plug for the book. So something we didn't really talk about is towards the end of Wilkerson's book, she talks about what the world looks like without caste. And she also expresses, she uses the example of post-World War II Germany about people who, you know, the folks who have inherited a world post the Nazi caste system. And I'm not going to go into detail. I'll leave it to you to really check it out. But one call to action I would say is go check that out, read it, because it could be us. We could be a world where there's no question losers of the Civil War don't get lionized, and that's not our history. It's the victory. It's how many people have come since and made lives and led the world in innovation and so on. That's our history. That's what we have to protect, and that's what we should be willing to die for. So as for my final just take home with you, not everyone's as lucky as I or you in that we have this community where we can take a risk and expose ourselves and what we really think and put our heart out there for folks that have gone through this. But each of you knows someone that doesn't have that available to them, and each of you could reach out and say, hey, this is what we talked about. This is what we can talk about in a circle, a small circle of trust. That's all I got.
Thank you both so much. You are truly leaders for a just and humane world. You are leading by example, and you inspire me to be a better colleague and a better citizen. I feel very emotional. So thank you so much. And I'm so grateful to have shared this space with you.